Good evening, everybody, and welcome to Crimes and Times. Recently, we all saw a very disturbing video of a police officer subduing a subject in Minneapolis, and that person subsequently died. We're going to talk about that today with an expert. We'll discuss with us proper police tactics and what he observed from that video. First, please let me introduce our co-host, Joel Nichols. Joel, thank you for joining us.
Well, you know, it's a very troubling story. One, again, in a series of troubling stories like this over the last few years, I'm very curious to see what our guest, who has such expertise on the front lines of police work, has to say about what he saw and how he would interpret that.
Thank you, Joel. And joining us tonight is Michael Castro. Michael is a retired Albuquerque Police Department deputy chief and a former police defensive tactics instructor. Thanks for joining us, Michael.
Thanks for having me, Mike.
And just for the audience, I have to give my disclaimer. As usual with my law enforcement visitors, there's a personal connection. You and I met over 20 years ago, if you can believe that, when I was the supervisor of the FBI's drugging gang task force in Albuquerque. And on that task force were a number of your detectives. So
Absolutely.
We worked daily with your police department. I was always appreciative and very impressed with the work they did. And thoughts, when you're impressed with them, you're impressed with the management. And that's how I got to know you. You were a captain at the time I met you. And more importantly, we became friends. And more importantly, you were my martial arts instructor.
Yes.
And if you could train this guy, you could do anything, man. That's how I see it, you know?
Yeah, thanks, man.
So anyway, Mike, the reason we asked you on, I really appreciate you coming on short notice, is you saw the video of what happened in Minneapolis. And you, with all your experience and your knowledge, which is a tremendous amount of experience and knowledge, you have a very definite opinion of what happened. Please give us your insight.
I do. And I have had opportunities since you asked me to look at other portions of video that I had not seen in the mainstream media since. My opinion has not changed. What I saw was a law enforcement officer with his knee and shin clearly across the neck of a suspect who was in custody and apparently not resisting at that time. By all accounts, it was there for at least 8 to 10 minutes, somewhere in that area. I'm hearing both on the internet. Much too long. I don't see this technique as being a viable technique for control of a suspect who's already in custody and not resisting. I was able to do a little research before I came online today, and I did note that in Minneapolis, they did have a policy in effect that would allow a vascular neck constraint applied with either the arm or the leg. That was at one point. Apparently has not been allowed for quite some time. I'm assuming that's what this police officer was applying at the time. Totally inappropriate for the circumstances. You have a white-collar crime, forgery, maybe a fourth-degree felony at best. Subject was not resisting. He was clearly in custody and under control. There were multiple officers on the scene. It was just unnecessary. It was disgusting to watch, especially being a former defensive tactics instructor and knowing that there are other viable techniques that would not put this subject in jeopardy. Positional asphyxia, which I mentioned in my Facebook post, is definitely a grave concern. All the signs were there. The subject was complaining that he could not breathe, could not move his chest, his stomach hurt. Basically what he was referring to, his diaphragm couldn't expand and contract the way it normally would if you were to take and inhale deep breaths. And this is due not just to the knee that was on the neck, but also the body weight of the officer that laid upon the top of this individual. There's other positions he could have been in. And as a matter of fact, earlier in the arrest, after he was taken from the car, he was actually allowed to sit down against a wall on the sidewalk by one of the officers. He was non-combative at that time as well, and for some reason was lifted up to his feet and escorted across the street to the other vehicle. The part that I'm missing for the video is what happened at the vehicle in order for them to feel that it was necessary to put the person prone down into the street area. That's the part I have not seen. But regardless of that, the subject was non-combative at the time. And clearly, this was unnecessary use of force.
Michael, let's go back. The first thing you mentioned was that compression using the arm or the leg. Is that what most of us know as the LA chokehold?
Well, there's a distinction to make between a vascular neck restraint and a chokehold. A vascular neck restraint cuts off the flow of blood to the brain, which essentially makes you lightheaded and often will make you pass out. A chokehold cuts off the airway and disables you from being able to breathe at all. I didn't see where this was close to a chokehold, although, maybe a closer inspection of the video, maybe it was cutting off his airway as well. But clearly that in reference to the Minneapolis policy at the time, at one time anyway, is that both a vascular neck restraint, either applied by the arm or the leg, was appropriate. But apparently that policy had expired and been reformed, no longer in effect.
Right. Based on your experience, Mike, in the PD, how long has it been since those type of techniques have been generally prohibited by most police departments?
I think it was basically in the mid-90s when most departments around the country just banned the use of a vascular neck restraint. And the reason why is in the midst of a scuffle, when you're battling with someone in the street, it may be difficult to apply a vascular neck restraint. And in the midst of this confusion and the fog of the fight, actually you're applying a chokehold. And the risk to the subject basically was deadly, and it was not worth the risk and the reward. So they went to other modifications and things like that, and defensive tactics at the time.
Michael, remember the Eric Gardner case in New York City?
Yes.
The guy selling cigarettes, and they put on sort of a chokehold. Is that similar, or were those two very different techniques? What we saw there and what we saw in Minneapolis?
I think what you saw was completely different. You had an individual wrapped around Gardner's neck. Again, I think the officer's intent was to apply a vascular neck restraint, make the subject pass out so he's easier to handcuff. But again, a combative subject, moving around, you're moving around. And I think what he did is he cut off his airway, and to the demise of Gardner.
Mm-hmm.
So we should mention, before we go too much farther, that the dead man's name is George Floyd. And a real live person who's dead now, who has family and friends who are suffering because of whatever decisions were or were not made properly that you're discussing right now. One of my sons said that he always thinks about the law enforcement officers who wake up in the morning and look at the headlines and see something like this story and realize how much more difficult their day is going to be going forward because of what happened on that video. The decisions made or incorrectly made in that video is when you answer a call, Mr. Castro, and Michael Tapman, you can answer this too. When you answer a call, are you answering the call about a subject as it's been referred to here, or is there a person on the other side of what you're doing? Like when these cops in Minneapolis, were they just restraining a subject, or did they realize this was a person that they're encountering for good or ill?
Michael?
Well, I think, and I wasn't in the minds of the officers at the time, but I think that anytime you receive a radio call of a crime in progress, you know that you're going to hopefully make contact with the offender and be able to effect an arrest or stop the crime itself. And whether the person was thought of as an individual, another human being, a person, that really depends on the training and the mindset of the officer himself. I could tell you that over my 26-year law enforcement career, answered many calls as such. Where the heart starts beating and the adrenaline starts pumping because there's a chance that you might arrive on scene while the offender's still present. So you don't know what to expect. I understand that anxiety that an officer feels, but this situation was a little bit different. As I had mentioned, it was a property crime at best, a fourth-degree felony perhaps, a forgery as it was reported. The subject was seated in a car. The officers approached him. They were able to remove him from the car and handcuff him. There might have been a little resistance at first. It's hard to see on the left side of the vehicle from the observation of the camera where it was posted. But whether they thought it was an individual, a person, another human being, I'm not sure. I think what they were looking at, it was an arrestee at that point. And they were going to treat him as such.
Michael, we've heard some comments, again, as you made reference to, a struggle prior to what we saw, which is possible, and there might be things that we didn't see. Mr. Floyd looked to be a fairly physically big man, right? Certainly intimidating. Does that change your perspective at all?
Well, again, it depends. You know, you had multiple officers on the scene. There were at least 2 officers who arrived initially, and then a third came as an additional backup, I think, from the park police, Minneapolis Park Police, who heard the radio call. So there were 3 officers on the scene when he was initially arrested. When he was removed from the vehicle, it looked like there was a little bit of struggle at the doorway, but not enough to warrant any type of defensive tactic. As a matter of fact, I didn't see the withdrawing of a baton or use of OC spray or anything at that point. They were able to physically pull his arms behind his back and handcuff him and then escort him to the curb. So beyond that, I don't see in any additional video any kind of resisting on this subject's part. Mr. Floyd, I'll refer to him as Mr. Floyd.
Right. And just for the record here, and Joel, you mentioned it, we talk about the subject. That's, common police vernacular. In law enforcement, we do tend to have a little bit of an emotional distance between us and the people for professional sake. So when someone like Michael and myself uses the term subject, it's not meant to be cold or show any indifference. It's just part of the police vernacular that we come to in explaining who everybody is in the scenario. Michael, you mentioned that he was moved from one place to the car, and we didn't see what happened that brought him to the point of being on the ground by the car. Let's take a guess here. I remember from my days as a cop before I was in the bureau for a few years, when people see themselves going into that car, it seems to get some sort of reaction as opposed to they might have been cooperative, but actually being shut in the back of that car. Have you seen that all of a sudden, that fear when it kind of hits in all of a sudden and they break bad at that moment?
Generally, that's when the fight starts. Even people who, genuinely hold their hands behind their back and are willing and able to be arrested, when it comes to being restrained inside the back of a police vehicle, then it becomes awful real for them. I didn't see that in the video. Unfortunately, that's not available. But what I did read on the internet is that at some point when he crossed the street, he was complaining that he was having medical issues at that time. So they called for an ambulance and or rescue to come to the scene to look at him. So I imagine that rather than put him in the car and then remove him again when the ambulance showed up, they were going to keep him outside. My question is why was he proned out and in such a position with that officer on top of him, rather than earlier, as he was, just placed or seated on the wall or seated on the curb, as we often do as we wait for medical assistance? Or if he was combative at that time, there are a multitude of positions that he could have been in safely without the risk of positional asphyxia, without any risk to the officers whatsoever. And none of that was employed at all. I'll tell you, just from watching the video of that officer, I think his intent, and I hate to do this, I hate to second guess, and I know I'm looking at this with 20/20 hindsight, but basically he was there to punish the individual. And, law enforcement officers need to detach themselves at that point. Once the person's under control, he's in custody, your job's done. You transport, you book him in jail. We'll allow the courts to decide what the punishment should be. But sometimes our emotions get the best of us. I could speak from personal experience throughout my career. I mean, it's hard, with all that adrenaline pumping and the heart pounding and everything, and now you've just been in a physical altercation. What do you do with all that? Where do you release it? I think this officer released it on Mr. Floyd, unfortunately, and that, it's a sad thing.
It is.
So Michael, I'll say Michael Castro because we have 2 Michaels on the same show.
Sure.
It's completely confusing for an old man like me, and I don't think we should ever do that again. But
well, you're addressing the better looking Michael. So go ahead.
Yeah. I spoke once to a man who had been with the State Patrol actually for many, many years, and he said that oftentimes what the public sees of video, like you just mentioned, you're looking at something with 20/20 hindsight. You can slow the video down and you take a look at it. When it's shown in court, oftentimes it might be slowed, a slower pace than the actual moment. In this case, though, since you studied this video, does it seem like that is relevant to this at all? Because in a heat of the moment kind of thing, maybe that video slowed down does give it a false sense of what was happening. But in this case, since you've studied the video, do you think that the video seems to be pretty accurate about, because I haven't seen nearly as much as you have, but it seems like it is a fairly, what you're seeing is what you get sort of situation. Would you look at it that way?
And most law enforcement officers do. We have to judge this. That's based on a 1989 decision by the Supreme Court, Graham versus Connor. And I think Michael's very familiar with this too. And it has to do with the reasonableness of the situation. And that's why I mentioned that 20/20 hindsight before. I could look at this clearly and say, oh my gosh, this is horrific. This was unnecessary. This Mr. Floyd did not need to die for this. Based on what I saw the individual this officer applying to Mr. Floyd at the time was completely unnecessary. You're not talking about a combative subject. You weren't talking about somebody resisting. Sure, he was a physically big person, but he was under control. He was handcuffed with his hands behind his back. Why he was kept in this position for an extended amount of time is beyond me. It can only tell me that there was some kind of malice in that officer's heart. And unfortunately, he exacted that in front of 3 other officers who also had an obligation to step in. Now, if your emotion's too high, that other officer's there for backup, not just to protect you from someone else, but just to protect you from yourself and your own actions. They failed to do that. They're as guilty as that officer.
Mike, you brought up a couple things, and I'm glad you mentioned. Often when we have police use of force issues locally, the media will ask me to comment on it. And the message I have is the same message that you're giving here. It doesn't matter what preceded the event. Police officers are police officers. And once that person is in custody, handcuffed, no longer a physical threat, the fight is over. No matter what we want to think. We're not judge, jury, and executioner. Our job is to take them to custody irrespective of a crime is committed or how mad or angry we may be. And I agree with you, it's a challenge, but it's a challenge every officer has to live up to. So if not, they're going to be held accountable. Now, one thing I saw, and I think I remember this correctly, Michael, is on the film, the video that most people are seeing, if you hear the conversation between the officer and Mr. Floyd, it sounds to me like several times the officer saying, well, you need to get in the car. And the Floyd saying, okay, I'll get in the car. But then there's no motion to let him up and get in the car. Did you see that? And did you have a reaction to that?
I didn't notice that particular exchange. I did hear Mr. Floyd's cry out, saying I couldn't breathe and so forth. But I didn't hear the officer say, well, you need to get in the car. But again, like you just mentioned, how's he going to get in the car when you have a large officer on your back, you're handcuffed, very difficult to get up on your own, let alone with that weight on your back and on your neck. It makes no sense. Whether the officer said that or not, whether he meant to do it or not, I'm not certain.
Right.
But I do know that, I don't know. I'm just so disgusted by it. It just, and Mr. Nichols mentioned it earlier. It affects all of us. It affects those officers now going to duty today.
Right.
Because now when they encounter maybe an individual on the street, and whether that individual be African-American or Hispanic or white, they're going to think twice about how's this officer going to treat me? Oh my gosh. Even if I'm cooperative, are they going to kill me? So it does affect the way we do our job. It puts us in jeopardy as law enforcement officers. I saw something very disturbing in the news feed. It was several very prominent Black artists, both singers and also movie stars, saying, what's it going to take for us to start fighting back? Almost a cry to arms. That is not a good mix. And I think the result of this, it's unfortunate for the people in Minneapolis. I know there was some rioting and things like that. I just hope that things settle down a little bit and we can see the clarity of this whole issue and get to the bottom of it and find justice for Mr. Floyd.
Let me ask you both, based on your experience in law enforcement and Mr. Castro, this in particular, this case and other cases like it, why does it happen? Is it a training issue? Is it systemic racism that some people would point to? Is it a combination of those things? Why does it happen? And a secondary question to that is it happening more than it used to, or are we just seeing it more because of the prevalence of cameras everywhere?
Michael?
You know, go ahead, Mike.
No, you first, please.
Certainly the advent of the movie camera, and we think back to, you know, more than 20 years ago when people were filming different things. It has brought law enforcement reaction into the limelight. You know, officers themselves have body cameras. They have vehicle cameras now for very good reason. There was a time when an officer's word was golden. What the officer said was what happened, and the judge and jury bought it. That's no longer the case. And why is that? Is it systemic or not? You know, it's a cyclical issue. It starts in the hiring process. We want to hire the best candidates as possible. I know a lot of departments around the country, and I hope I'm not going off track here, but I think a lot of departments in the country are looking to get those candidates, and we're not getting the amount and quality of candidates that we had 20, 30 years ago, unfortunately. People don't want to go into law enforcement any longer. When I went into law enforcement, I went into it was a vocation, it was a profession, it was something I wanted to do. And when they asked me during my board, I did want to help the community. I wanted to protect and serve. I thought those were great ideals, and it fit my personality, it fit where I came from, how I was brought up. Now, people get hired. Sometimes they get hired just because they're looking for a job. You don't just get the same quality individual. So it starts with the hiring process. Then it's training and clear policy about the use of force. And a lot of times it's maintenance of training. Sometimes departments fail in that regard. And then it's a periodic review. Maybe they're not reviewing their use of force policies. I think the videos and things that we've seen have forced the departments to re-review and rethink their use of force policies. And hopefully you'll see a change, but not everybody's affected in the same way. And there's bad people or bad apple in every barrel. And maybe this individual, he just got through the system. And maybe this is a pattern. I don't know. We need to look at this individual and see what his pattern of use of force was. Was this a pattern or was this a singular event? We don't know. So I can't explain what happened here other than I think he let his emotion get the best of him. He let his anger and his rage control his actions. Again, Mr. Floyd was the one who suffered for it.
Right, Mike, I think, you know, you're right in that regard. It was probably sort of not a bad apple, but let me say somewhat of an isolated apple, because even though we've seen a lot of it lately, and some of that might appear to be more than usual because of the onset of cameras, but I think there's approximately 700,000 police officers in the United States. And if you think about the thousands and thousands of man hours that are going on every day of officers out there interacting with people, we don't hear of this that often in relative to that large number. And I think that's probably good news in that these bad incidents aren't common. We hear about them more. And one of them is too many. But if we compare them to the large number of officers that are out there, you know, it's probably statistically very small. Would you agree on that?
I would agree.
You know, Mike, back when I was working with your department, back when I was in New Mexico, I remember that your guys had body recorders, not cameras. We didn't have the technology then, but for sound. And they put them on whenever we went on a drug raid. They always put those on for one reason, to prove to the courts, in case there's an accusation, that they announced who they were. And there's no question of their identity. I remember thinking back then, I was like, wow, that's great. Why didn't the FBI think of that, right? And, you know, and now that seems so primitive, you know, 20 years later. But right. It was certainly avant-garde at the time. Mike, let me get off to something else now, because you talked about the fact, here we are talking about it. And we're doing what all talking heads do. We're retired, we're giving a personal opinion, and we're giving it only to the court of public opinion, where we like people to listen and take into account, but it really has no bearing on what's going to happen. An officer is charged with, you know, pretty serious misconduct. He and 3 others fired within 24 hours of the event. Did you have any thoughts about that? Again, we don't know what happened. We don't know what the police department did. But as a former, you know, deputy chief, what do you think about that?
Well, obviously the firing was a knee-jerk reaction that probably emanated from the mayor's office. I don't know if you saw the interview with the mayor of Minneapolis, and he too obviously disgusted about the incident. Needed to do something, whether it be protective or not, by acting so quickly or not. I mean, the officers should be afforded due process like everyone else. There are procedures in place, investigatory bodies in place that could have carried it out. And they generally do, and they keep the officers suspended, but they generally don't fire them that quickly. I think you're going to see some repercussions because of that. Again, I didn't think it was necessary. I think they could have been suspended with or without pay, didn't matter. And then an investigation begun.
No, I agree. That's why I brought it up. When I heard that 24 hours, 4 officers fired, it seemed kind of quick, knee-jerk reaction. Joel, as a private citizen, looking at that, did you have a reaction to that one way or another?
Well, my immediate reaction, because it was coupled with the video, was good. That seems like what you should do. It seems like so obvious to those of us just watching it on television, and you need to do something. So just as a human being looking at the video juxtaposed by the action, there's a part of me that goes, yeah, I understand that. I do also, though, in retrospect, understand that not only will there will be repercussions for that behavior, immediately firing 4 officers, but if you want justice of some sort in this case, meaning the person responsible for the death of George Floyd to be tried and go through that due process, this firing may actually prejudice some of that down the road, because I think that it probably would have been wiser from a legal standpoint to suspend without pay, so as not to prejudice any future legal action. But that's 24 or 48 hours of thought. The initial thought, sure, my initial thought is, oh, that looks awful, do something. But with a calmer reflection, I think it may actually do more to harm whatever justice should come down than the other way around. I don't know. Does that work that way, Mr. Castro? That it could come back in the court system and not redound well.
Exactly. During the Rodney King incident, for example, there was a big public outcry to fire those officers at the time. But everybody's got rights, and they were suspended for a very, very long time. Many of them retaining their positions thereafter. But the court of public opinion is what it is. I think I had that first reaction that you had as well. But then knowing the procedures and the way things are generally handled, I was quite surprised when I heard the news that they were fired. Again, I think that emanated from the mayor's office. I may be trying to avoid the public discord that followed. Maybe that was his response. Hey, look what I've done. I'm on your side, that kind of thing. But again, I think it may backfire when it does go to court, because it does prejudice a jury. It prejudices a judge as well. So time's going to tell.
Michael, when we think back on what happened and we see there's a firing of 4 officers, 3 who were there didn't physically take part of this, but isn't it conceivable that there's some, sort of factor to be involved there, that like maybe one was a rookie police officer who just didn't feel right interfering. Maybe he thought he was wrong, or a situation where the officer just felt by interfering in the arrest, he'd be making the situation worse. Isn't that, a possible factor that we should look at?
Mike, anything's possible. And I know what the pressure is, for example, a senior officer over a rookie officer. The rookie officer wants to be accepted into the group, and he generally goes along with the herd. But regardless of that, I think there's right and there's wrong. And I think the way you look at this situation, I think the other officers failed to act. They could have intervened at any point. If the object was to keep him under control, they could have assisted to keep him under control without keeping him proned out and your knee on his neck. Again, like I mentioned, there are many other positions he could have been in, which he wasn't afforded. And for whatever reason, they chose not to intervene. I don't know what those reasons are, and I guess that will come to light during the investigation.
Right, but I think if they'd done an investigation before, as we said, firing them, they might have gotten better cooperation from an officer. Maybe there was some mitigating circumstance such as a rookie
Sure.
cop. Yeah. Mike, let me go back to something. Given your experience and your expertise in defensive tactics, now we know that Mr. Floyd yelled out, "I can't breathe." Eric Gardner yelled out, "I can't breathe." In your experience, especially when you're on the street, you probably employed a number of defensive tactics, holds and stuff. Do you remember a lot of people just saying, "I can't breathe," when in fact they were just looking for you to loosen up your grip or use that to an advantage?
I don't remember an exact situation like that. I think that's always in an officer's mind. Even when a person stops resisting, okay, get me under arrest. You don't know what their intent is. And until you have physical control of the individual and then mechanical control through the use of handcuffs, you're at risk. You're at risk of being injured yourself or, the subject getting away. So I have heard individuals who are down on the ground saying, "I can't breathe," or, "You're hurting my back, you're hurting my neck, my arm hurts," or whatever it is. Those are common, but they're momentary because once the person is under mechanical control, there's no need to apply that pressure any longer as long as they're not resisting. So I'm not sure in this situation what the circumstances were as far as the control or why this officer felt that he needed to exact the control. One interesting thing, I don't know if you noticed this in part of the video, but when the individual officer has his knee on Mr. Floyd's neck, he actually inserts his hand in his left pocket, his left hand in his pocket,
Yes.
very casually, just keeping it there. I just found that very, very interesting as to why he's doing that. I mean, if you're working on balance and controlling somebody who's moving or resisting, you want your hands out because you want to be able to brace yourself. So I think by that officer's actions, you can obviously see that Mr. Floyd wasn't going anywhere. And obviously this officer wasn't going to allow him to go anywhere.
Yeah, the internet has picked up on that rather quickly, and I think that
Yeah.
will also be, used in court. Michael, let's move a little bit. Let's put sort of a prosecutorial hat on this, even though we're not prosecutors. Is there enough evidence based on what you see for an arrest? And if there is, what do you think the charge would be? And do you think that's the appropriate way to go?
Well, I think a base charge should be at least manslaughter. Until you can prove intent beyond that through interviews and everything like that, that'd be a good place to start right now. And then, same for everybody who was involved there. And then, you just let everything just kind of pan out the way it is through the investigation process. And then you go to court and you get testimony and you find out, hey, maybe we need to amend this charge. Maybe it's a murder charge. Maybe this person did have some kind of stated malice. Maybe we didn't hear everything. Maybe he said something on the way to the call to his partner. Maybe there was something over the radio transmission. We don't know. I think manslaughter is a good place to start.
Would you suggest, there's probably, I don't think it'd be tough for a prosecutor now to go in front of a judge and show probable cause for an arrest. Do you think they should do that now, or do you think they should wait until after they do an internal investigation or the FBI does their civil rights investigation?
Well, it's always a matter of timing, and it's really up to the DA's office. If I charge the person now and take them in custody, then I have X amount of days to prove to the court and to go to a preliminary hearing and decide why the judge should keep him in jail or release him. A lot of DAs in certain circumstances, especially this, because it's going to be a very politically heated situation, I think the DA, I think their best course of action is to wait, is to conduct the investigation as is, and then come forward with the full amount of charges as they can.
About 5 or 6 years ago, Minneapolis flew me up there to discuss with the media another case of police use of deadly force, unarmed black man who had been handcuffed, at least at the moment. And as I looked at it, everything, it was my belief that there would not be charges, especially federally. The FBI was doing their civil rights, and there weren't. But the DA, and I don't know if it's the same DA now, but he put all the evidence on the internet, everything he could disclose legally, into his decision-making process. And I thought that was tremendous. What better way to assure the public, even though many people won't be happy with the decision, to at least be transparent. Let them know this is the facts, this is the evidence, and this is the reason why I made my decision. I hope we see that again. I hope we see that more often, as a matter of fact.
Yeah, that's been the mode now for the past 10 years in law enforcement, is transparency, transparency, transparency. because, we've lost public trust. I hate to say it. So you need to show your cards from the get-go. Show them the procedures, show them what you're doing, how you conducted business, and let them decide. And if they don't agree with your decision, then fine. But at least they had the same information you did to make that decision.
So, Mr. Castro, let's talk a little bit about public trust, because that's a great thing to discuss right now. In your positions over the years, where you are, in a superior position to a lot of law enforcement officers, something maybe like this, not this exact thing, but what do you do in that position when something like this comes to you and you realize that you do have a responsibility to your officers and to those who are going out there every day trying to do the job in the right way, but you also have responsibility to the public trust, as you said. So what would you say to just those of us who are going to watch this unfold that would make us understand that there is a sense of responsibility and integrity on the side of the police department, that we're going to get the real story and they're going to do what's right for the community, not just what's right for their officers?
Well, I think you saw the chief of police in Minneapolis. Believe his last name's Ariando. He came out publicly and made a statement, and that's where it starts. It starts from the head of the organization. And I think he set the mood. He came out and did not agree with what the officers did. It's clear to him that the officers were guilty as charged. And he put his officers out there by doing so. He puts his department out there by doing so. But I think, and if you were to look, and I took kind of an informal poll, because unfortunately, when you post something on Facebook, as I did this morning, you get hundreds, if not thousands, of responses from law enforcement officers all around the country. The vast majority, and I mean 98.9%, have been in favor of what I said, believing that what this individual did was wrong, and he should be charged, and there should be some justice for Mr. Floyd. So, this is kind of a clear-cut case. Where it becomes difficult in those not so clear-cut cases, how does the chief react? How does he gain public trust? But that transparency helps. I think he needs to be out there continuously talking to the public. He needs to be out there meeting with public leaders, whether it be folks in the ministry, folks in, running these public organizations, especially in the neighborhoods that are affected by this. The more he gets out there and the more he tries to regain that public trust through the transparency and offering up what he has at that particular time, I think eventually things are going to calm down. I think right now it's a flashpoint, and I think we just need some time for everybody to take a deep breath and step back and continue.
I agree. Michael, thank you so much for your insight. You've given us a lot of thoughts, and based on your experience, your expertise, a lot for people to think about, and I think you provided a lot of clarity to the situation. Joel, any last questions for Mr. Castro?
Well, let me ask you both a last question. As somebody who, when I watch old movies and I see the old cop on the beat kind of character in an old movie, or I even watch Adam 12, and I spoke to a lot of police officers over the course of my life who mentioned Adam 12 as something they actually was kind of a cultural touchstone for them. I wanted to do what Reed and Malloy did, just like a lot of EMT guys and women told me, I want to do what the kids in emergency did. I want to do that. So, but in those kind of fictional and semi-fictional stories, the idea of a police officer being a part of the community seemed to be such an important element. So I'm wondering, Mr. Castro, is that something we're missing now? Are police officers just not part of their community in the way they once were, and then that leads to this, or at least it exacerbates the sense of distrust?
Well, community policing, which is a term that's, it's been around for 40 years, something that we practiced in Albuquerque, New Mexico, the entire time that I was there. We had officers exchanging personal cell phone numbers with people in the community, so they can make that call and that connection quicker to the officer. Officers attended community meetings. Officers went to homes of people and visited. If you could keep something human to human, generally everybody's better off. You do your job more efficiently. You generally have less, and you have more allies on your side. And that's what you want as a police officer. It's hard being the single officer out there on the beat. But when I have 30, 40, 50 neighbors who are involved in that neighborhood and know me and like me, and I've gained their trust, they're more apt to share information with me and help me do my job a lot more efficiently. I think that is the case in most communities in the United States, even today. Whether they've lost that old cop on the beat feeling and everything, sure, technology's changed things. The advent of vehicles changed things a lot. But I think we're still making that connection now. We're making it through social media, certainly through cell phones. That was kind of the big thing when I was a law enforcement officer, having that immediate connection. But, you know, I see what you're getting at. And, you know, it's always the old days. The old days were better. You know what? The old days were different, as today is different. We need to handle things differently. But there's ways to connect with the public right now and to maintain that trust. And again, I think the vast majority of law enforcement officers around the country practice that.
I agree. Michael, thank you so much. It was great seeing you, old friend.
Good seeing you too, Mike.
Same here. Please give my regards to your lovely wife. Okay.
And yours too.
All right. Thank you. Joel, thanks for joining us. And everybody, thanks for joining us tonight on Crimes and Times. This was a special edition. I think we had a guest that just gave us so much information and insight. You got to hear an expert opinion on what happened there. And I think you should think about everything he had to say. Good night, and we'll see you next time.